Welcome back to Parley, a series where you folks support the entertainment I'm making by requesting the topic of your choice for $9 a month. And today, Pingers has requested some discussion about build crafting communities around build crafty games. Pinger says, as players of live service games with frequent updates and ongoing evolving buildcraft, how can we as members of those games communities work toward making the community as productive and helpful as it can be? In a handful of games that you play that match that description, the communities vary quite a bit, even beyond aesthetic differences, and apparent differences in attitude or temperament. As an example, one game's community might welcome a new player with a link to a wiki and maybe some general maxims or instructions, while another might point you to a specific YouTube guide or a similar third party to try to make sense of the game as it stands. To be sure, some of my observation here is just coming from the designs of the games we're talking about. Yeah, and that would be a very different parlay question. So the developer and their design choices, their transparency, clarity, and communication frequency all have a role in shaping the way the game community forms around the game, but what I'm interested in is if there's an ideal state or mindset for a game community to aspire towards, when you know the game you're playing is prone to ongoing changes. No developer or game is completely perfect, and certainly neither are the group of people playing it, but given a developer-game pair with all their flaws, how can the community try to compensate to make the experience of entering that game community better? What can we do? What should we avoid? What a wonderfully worded question. A lot there. You've also specified helpfully that this isn't meant to be about the interesting, complicated, a bit separate topic of how the design of a game influences the community, a topic I think I've personally spent more time thinking and talking about than this, which is, but what about the community itself? I think that the initial problem is that it becomes kind of a chicken before the egg scenario where, the thing that you can control more is the game. I personally feel like developers trying to make a community for their game a certain way directly, rather than making their game a way that creates a community they would like, are sort of like doing damage control permanently. It's much more effective to change the game, I guess. But of course, as a consequence, it's also harder to change the game. We can't change the game, not really anyway. So we're left to do what we can about the community. So a really interesting question. I have kind of two sections. The first one is about good stuff to do in buildcraft communities, and then we're going to move on to, I thought it was really interesting the way you worded that idea of an ideal state or mindset for a buildcraft community. I could do like a whole day of parlays just on the idea of like optimal games, I guess, and the communities that would result from them. And I know that in various games, I've experienced like more or less distinct communities. For example, I found the Deep Rock Galactic community pretty memorable. The way that they will say rock and stone in even the comment section of a YouTube video as a way to kind of keep positive is interesting, and I'll try to touch on that as we go, or at least stuff like it. There are communities that I find less distinct or that have like changed very noticeably. I perceive the Warframe community on Twitch as having changed a ton over time. It's hard because I've changed a lot over that time too, but that's just my perception. Anyway, so really interesting, a long prelude for a complicated subject. But I'm going to start with three things that I think you can do in a Buildcraft community that make that better, that are good. Do these things. Don't not do these things. There'll be lots of things not to do, don't worry. The first one is to briefly explain why you're recommending something. This doesn't have to be explaining the entire fundamental fabric of reality of the game. Simply to recommend a thing that is commonly recommended while explaining, like, in one sentence, why this thing is considered to be good. What this does, and this is all going to be quite combined, you're going to see how these things flow into each other, ideally. What that does is create an environment where players won't default to something when the reason people are recommending it doesn't actually apply, because this tries to prevent people from repeating advice without actually knowing why it's given, basically. And again, I think that this solves a lot of very simple problems. A really easy example of this would be Genshin Impact and Noblesse Oblige, an artifact set, a gear set, that makes your character basically like it just makes their big move more powerful, and they give like a damage buff to the team when they use it. The buff given by the effect, though, doesn't stack and doesn't give you that much more damage. It's a pretty modest damage boost, especially if the characters already have a lot of similar attack boosts on their kit. Trying to explain this in a way where if you don't play Genshin Impact, you kind of get it. And, not understanding the relative modesty of that damage increase, if you thought it was like 20% more of all their damage, which it really isn't, it would sound a lot better than it is. And if you didn't know it didn't stack, you might put it on like way more characters, that kind of mitigates its effectiveness. I would recommend Noblesse Oblige and Genshin Impact as a sort of fallback option, not as a default option for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that, well, it doesn't stack, so it gets a lot worse if there's two characters on a team that are both using it, a lot of the time anyway. Sometimes you'll get more uptime. It's not quite that simple, but this is just an example. Another way to think about it is the way people talk about, for example, like critical stats or weapons being really good in Warframe. I'm guilty of this to some extent. Yeah, it's good that if a weapon has critical stats and status output, but that's good because those things are damage. It's just that a weapon's base damage would have to be so inordinately high to catch up to the benefit of having those separate multipliers that you simply will not find weapons with that much more damage. You're only going to get that from, critical stats and status effects. A lot of players really overlook how status effects, if you read what the status effects do, pretty obviously increase your damage output, but because it isn't explained, and again, I think I'm guilty of this to some extent too, why you would want status output. A lot of players think, oh, well, it's just like some extra utility thing. Whereas if you were to say, like, because it increases your damage, etc., I think a lot of people would get it. So again, to really drive the point home, this piece of advice about briefly explaining the recommendation is not me telling you that you or anybody else has to, or certainly don't have to do anything, or should, like, attempt to explain the entire game all at once. Just that when people, let's just be blunt and say, mindlessly recommend like the same thing everyone in the entire universe recommends, why not take just a quick moment to explain why? Like, it's usually extremely straightforward why the thing is a common recommendation. Why not just take a moment to mention that? I think another example would be like maybe there's an item or a type of gear or like a mod or I don't know, whatever in these games that is very broadly useful, and just briefly rattling off a laundry list of places where it could be used is, pretty, I guess, a very primitive measure for like demonstrating its usefulness, but it's better than nothing. I think that a lot of people just feel like they're at a bit of a loss. They know what they're like supposed to get, but they don't really know why. I also think that this leads into kind of a thing later I'm going to talk about not taking the game seriously in a way that the game doesn't prompt, I guess, and making the player feel like they really need things, that things are like necessary or like the most valuable effect. It's really helpful to put into perspective to what extent that's actually warranted in the game at large. Like, what benefit does this give you? Will you die and fail missions if you don't get this? Or does it just make it easier, for example? Stuff like that. Although that gets a little bit more complicated, but it can be very simple to explain why, a generally useful buildcraft idea is generally useful. It's usually pretty straightforward for these broad applications. And when something is more specific, explain in greater detail. Like, why not? I don't know. If you don't know, it's fine to say, I don't know. It's just been my experience that this is effective. Which leads me into my second point about trying very hard not to state your ideas as facts. Nobody knows all builds in a game. So when a thing seems very good or the thing is like the build, I think a lot of people kind of scoff at this. Like everybody knows there isn't only one way to build the thing. I'm just saying the build because like we all know what build I'm talking about, right? But people don't. People don't know. This is kind of like when people argue about the definition of like a genre word. There are people in those conversations that are thinking like, yeah, people use it different ways, but there's a right way to use it. And there isn't. There isn't a right way to use it. That's not really how language works. There's different contexts for different words, and they are necessarily subjective. They still have an effect. You know, they have an effect when the person doesn't know what you mean. They're going to default to what those words would mean without context. And the suggestion becomes that there is one single effective way to build this thing, which is perverting a buildcraft game that is trying to be really interesting into something incredibly boring and dull. And I think that's very sad. I don't know why other people aren't saddened by that idea. I would think that people would, hearing themselves say it that way, just naturally not wish to say it that way. And I think that the reason some people still do, this might not be common, but I've heard this before, is that they feel like, yeah, but those other ways of doing it just really don't measure up. Like they're just not as good. So like it's an affectation or it's being cute to recommend those other things. And nobody can experience the effectiveness of every build. Like everybody can only use the builds they have. And so simply discussing the experience you've had as an experience is a much better approach, is a much more helpful approach. And it also, again, it opens the door, combined with that first point, to encourage players not to feel like they need to know why a thing is effective. Your experience still matters, even if you don't know why you're having it. It's just not a sample size of one that we're then going to take as apocryphal, you know? Like that doesn't matter. We can just give each other our experiences. Nobody is an authority on the thing, and nobody should really try to be an authority on the thing. A really common way that the idea of stating your opinion as a fact is misused, something to watch out for, in my opinion, is this knee-jerk reaction people have. They like to explain that they're qualified to weigh in on a subject because like they main that character or they've played a bunch of hours of that character. This is probably going to be the hottest take part of this parlay, but I believe that generally speaking, after a certain point, sort of seniority bias makes you a worse source of information, not a better source of information. You become set in your ways or lacking the perspective of other options rather than really gaining more knowledge. Imagine games like, again, Genshin Impact, Warframe. Are you really learning entirely new things about the character or whatever, the build, once you've played it for like, you know, a couple dozen hours? No, these games don't have varied enough gameplay for that to be the case. That's not bad. Not a knock against these games that I love. It simply is untrue that you gain more information by spending hundreds of hours on the character. That just makes you more biased. It would be better to actually go the opposite way and undercut one's impression of something by saying, you know, I've been using this way for hundreds of hours and I really like this, but I've been using only that build for hundreds of hours, so take that with a grain of salt. I just think that's a much more effective, conversational, really respectable way. Like I would, you know, have a round of applause for you for acknowledging this thing. Smart people don't ever think people are an authority anyway when they hear somebody argue that they're an authority because they have seniority. Spending a lot of time on something, I'll tell you from my experience, again, the hottest take part of this parlay, when I hear somebody say I spend a lot of time on something, I think, wow, how inefficient of them. They must not be very skilled, which is a very judgmental thing to say. That is totally reductive and kind of mean, and like, maybe I should respect people's seniority in the subject a little bit more, right? I'm not encouraging you to agree with that or go that far, but it's not good. It's not only good to have done something for a long time. So I think that a thing that would benefit these communities a lot is to not attempt to claim that you have some like parameters by which you are the person people should listen to. That's tacky and shallow. Just say what your experience was. There's no need to claim that it is the experience. No one is telling you your experience is wrong because they had another experience. The problem with this is it won't work. People who do this are insecure, and people who don't are mature. And you can't encourage people to simply broadly be mature. It just has to kind of happen. This kind of gets back to my thing about, like, I think that this may be mostly pointless and you just need a game that encourages it, but it is good if you can do it. I don't know. And some people just kind of do it automatically, thinking, oh, it's no big deal. And I might have changed one person watching this. I might have changed your mind, which is, I guess, all I can really hope to have done, right? Okay, so not stating your ideas as facts. Nobody knows all builds. Your experience is your experience, and you not being a source of authority because you are not doesn't take that away from you. You still get your experience, but everybody else's experiences also happened. I also think there's a related point that people will not accept this advice, but that people tend to dig in their heels that, just because this thing is technically not, like, doesn't really work that way, means that your life didn't happen. Like, sometimes it feels that way to people. Like, if something is working well for you, let's say a character that's not very popular in a game, and is technically not very qualified. Here's a good example in Genshin Impact. Barbara, a character you're given as part of the tutorial process, a lot of those characters are very effective. Now, Barbara heals a lot, but doesn't really do anything else, and there really aren't any other healers in Genshin Impact that are so thin. The other ones heal you for enough as well, they just do other things. So it is fair to say, from a technical perspective, that Barbara is the worst healer in an ultra reductive way. But when you say that, there will be someone who says, but I have succeeded with this character, so that can't possibly be true, because I had this experience where they worked well for me. And the solution here is like, yeah, maybe this other character could be even more effective for you. I think those people have this weird, like, really stupid, fine, but they're confused because it sounds like other people are trying to convince them that they didn't live their own life, And again, I think the solution here is really just to say, I've had a lot of luck with this thing. And if the person digs their heels in and says, no, only I'm right, whatever, believe me, that person won't succeed socially in that community for a long time. And this brings me to the final thing for this little section. As a piece of advice that I've tried to take to heart, I think I'm getting better at, but it's a long way to go, is this idea that you can't change someone's mind in one sitting. You can, in a community, have a large effect on someone, but only in very, very, very small bits. So when somebody says, some toxic thing, or they, have a really entrenched opinion about a character, you have to keep in mind that it's impossible to get them to let go of that in that one sitting. Like, no matter what you type to them, if you say, like, that's just totally wrong or whatever, they're going to dig in more, not less. So it's pointless. What you can do is, wait, but don't say nothing. Take the opportunity to say, yeah, I've had the experience that this thing was the case rather than this other thing. You don't have to worry that other people looking at that person's just, like, blatantly wrong or judgmental or crappy opinion will catch on, as long as you provide another opinion. You don't have to insist that it's correct instead of theirs. That makes it less effective. You don't have to even necessarily explain, like, what the problem with that other one is. If your opinion is, like, more fun or more useful or whatever, and people see them side by side, that other person's crappy opinion, if it really is so bad, will die out. There is a natural selection of ideas there. As long as there are other options alongside that idea, and this one loudmouth who has this misconception about a thing doesn't prevent other people from saying their thing. In other words, as long as you do my second thing about, just stating the experience you had, I believe that generally over time, the good ideas will rise to the top. And if something is true, it will overcome the bias of, like, some people just having a kind of a not helpful take on the thing. Broadly, I think a good example of how this is true, if I haven't convinced you that it is that when you look at the things that are popular in a game, they're reliably, like, pretty good. They're relevant to the game. There might be some confusion around, like, things in the middle or the bottom of like a tier list for a game. But I found that the top is almost always pretty on point. That thing, there's no meaningful way in which anything is ever actually the best thing. And there will be something at the top of the tier list that is the best thing that isn't in any meaningful way. But that thing, like, is very good. The community is not like full of morons. They're just oversimplifying things. And usually, something being good in a buildcraft type game, it's going to be broad. And so, oversimplifying something the strength of which is that it's good at a lot of things will damage it much less, I think. Which is why generally, in Genshin Impact, people widely understand that Bennett is extremely effective because he does acceptable damage and creates a lot of particles alongside a great heal and a huge damage buff that are really easy to enable in a great element. A lot of people understand that, building for your hybrid stats is really good. And I think part of that is simply because in Warframe, people test a lot of different mod builds. And so, of course, it's going to become it is better to build a mix of different stats mathematically because they're separate multipliers, and there aren't mods that give such blunt amounts of one stat as to override the benefit of separate multipliers in Warframe. And so, if people try all other options, they won't need to know why it's better to use separate multipliers. It just blatantly is. It's plain to see that it is. In Fake Grand Order is another example of a game that I think people don't always look at the most critically, but the characters that truly are the most broadly applicable really are the most considered to be good characters. I think broadly games get that rather correct. They do a pretty good job of that. If a thing is broadly accepted as a good idea in a community, it frequently is a good idea. It's just usually a very general or broad or vague idea. It's not going to be a specific idea. Frequently, it will be good, but there'll be even better things in certain specific situations because those things got the short end of the stick with becoming broad recommendations. They were kind of simplified out of existence, if you will. Or they require their explanation to be good, but people don't know the explanation because they don't do the first thing I suggested, where they briefly explain why something is good, and so they kind of get put under the bus. So I hope in that little segment I did a good job pitching a few simple things. I think really simple that you can do just verbally, just typing in a Reddit thread on a community that will vaguely improve it. Like, they're not going to make it worse. Simply stating why you're giving, commonplace advice. No need to explain too much, just explaining when it's useful. People vaguely come to understand when that is helpful. Second, avoiding stating your ideas as facts. Simply saying that you had this experience or sharing your experience is more helpful and also just the better look, let's be blunt, than trying to claim that you are the authority on a thing you are not, or that there is only one way to do a thing. Nobody really knows that. And even if a build blatantly seems to be better than another, these types of games generally make it a bit difficult to test in a rather pure way. Generally, I've said on streams a lot that I think it's kind of unhelpful to test things in these games because there's many factors, including but not limited to not being sure if the thing is actually supposed to work that way sometimes. The bias for the gear you have is usually better than like some new weird thing. Will be less ranked up or whatever, and so it will seem worse. It would be very hard to have it be as good. Gameplay bias, you're not as used to playing the thing that way. So it's better to just say that you've had this experience, and hopefully if there is some weird niche build, eventually some lunatic will spend their time on it. Because it's their job, and they will play both the more obvious builds and the less obvious builds, and we'll get a little bit of a clear picture by working together. This is what a lot of my streams are good for, about what things are useful and in what way. And finally, to keep in mind that generally good ideas are selected for in these communities. You don't have to worry too much about some misconception getting spread all over the place. There's no need to try to denounce that. It's not going to work. It's better to just say the experience you had that was different and let them both exist. People will try some of one and some of the other, and if yours is really so much better, it will win out. There's no need to do anything to cause that to happen. It can feel hard. It can feel like someone is misleading people, but it doesn't work in a community like this to attempt to convince people that like that's just wrong or toxic information. Usually being put in a situation like that is you've kind of already lost, I guess. But that gets a little bit into manipulating a social experience, which is a topic I'm deeply interested in, as you can tell, but goes a bit outside the scope of this parlay. We're assuming that you're, hanging out in a community on the periphery, not periphery. Anyway, that you're. I always have trouble with that word for some reason. That you're not over invested in the community and bridging to the ideal state or mindset topic. I'll give 3 things for that before we finish up. I'd like to say that I think that's what underpins this whole thing. I believe very strongly that people who spend a ton of time just talking about something on the internet, like not just hanging out in a Twitch stream, not just casually hanging out on a Discord server, talking to all of you mostly. I'm talking about people who live and breathe a games community. There are going to be problems. Like and games are not really intended to be able to fulfill that. Playing other games will always be a perspective granting experience. You can't be good at anything as a human being unless you do a variety of things. It is simply not possible to have useful perspective on anything. And I would argue that perspective is most of what helps with anything in the modern world if you do one thing too much. And so, of course, the ideal state or mindset thing is going to be, in quick notes form, taking a somewhat casual attitude toward the game. I'll elaborate on these in a minute. Taking a break, encouraging people to take a break. And perhaps that means that at the very bottom of this discussion, we should make better resources to help people catch up on games. So I'll elaborate. But those are the things I think are useful. The ideal state or mindset for a game community is, I think, a somewhat casual one, first of all. Like most of these games are designed in a way where you do not need to make the best build, or there is no best build in the game. Otherwise, there wouldn't be options. There'd be no point in there being options. At the very least, the thing I always like to say is, a lot of players are under the misconception that there is one best thing in a game. But at the very least, I'm sure people would agree that the developer's goal when presenting different options to the player is that they intend them to be different options. They intend them to be viable options. Maybe they aren't, and maybe they don't feel like viable options to you, but obviously the developer's goal is for them to be viable options. They're supposed to be good. Like, it's not surprising that there would be multiple things that are really good, because that is the only point of there being options in the game. If the game, lets you buildcraft your own, strategy, playstyle approach. And so, for Warframe, for example, I frequently mention how it just seems kind of hollow or pointless to pursue what seems to be the most powerful thing, because the developer's goal is to make it so that doesn't exist, which is good if done well. If they just over nerf the thing, if they clumsily eliminate the source of the imbalance, then that's bad, of course. But a game that is balanced, where everything is powerful. Now, remember when I said balanced, there was that previous parlay. A lot of you thought, oh, that just means things get nerfed or whatever. No, the meaning of the term balance would be that things are good, useful, viable, that things are balanced to be fun, to be powerful, to be effective, to be good choices. Not balance doesn't mean nerfed. I mean, whatever. That's a subjective idea of the idea of balance, but I mean good balance. I don't know. And taking this mindset to these games, I think that people get defensive because they feel like the way for them to participate in the community is they've got to have some new hotness that's probably somewhat unintentionally powerful, and also probably pretty subjectively powerful. Like, that player, again, nobody knows all builds, so that player will feel like it's really remarkable in a way that other players won't, and then they'll just get into an argument because those people are not on the same page. They do not have common ground under which an argument could be reached. If you have different amounts of experience playing builds in a game, it will seem like the other person is just blatantly wrong because you've had different experiences than they have. And that's okay as long as you're not trying to be right, as long as you're just sharing the experiences you've had. Sometimes something that was good early on in a game gets kind of put under the bus as we adopt the strategies that utilize everything available in the game's gizzards. I don't think things have multiple gizzards usually, but there you go. And sometimes that means we overlook things that a newer player to the environment might think is really good. Also, a lot of the time, of course, the newer player simply isn't aware of the other, buildcraft tools in the game, or just like what the game will be like later. And so, yeah, they at the moment something seems very good that will be moderated later. It will seem like, what is even the point in whatever. People are very quick to claim that they have information about the game, which again, I just feel like, of course, people want to feel like an authority. But if you create a game community where the thing that you do to participate doesn't have to be like be knowledgeable, it's just be playing the game. If that's the thing that it looks like is participating in a community, other people will see that. And this is the way humans work socially. They'll respond by participating that way. And then you'll get a community full of people, if everybody did this, that don't try to be like toxically correct about some subjective part of the game for which it is not possible to be correct. And that could theoretically be very good. So I do think that mindset is an ideal. Again, sort of an open question whether people can ever actually do that or whether that's just the game. But anyway, taking a break. Yeah, somewhat casual attitude. These games usually don't find themselves tuned so tightly that you need to have like the best build, or there even is such a thing, because that makes it ridiculously difficult to balance these games. They'll generally be fairly lenient with their requirements, which means it doesn't matter in the first place that you have like the most powerful build or whatever. Kind of going back to the thing about your ideas as facts. Another thing is like your preferences. Like if you prefer to have something that just does a ton of damage, simply acknowledging that like, I don't even need this much damage, but I just really like seeing the huge damage number. Like, it seems small, but that helps. It doesn't paint the game as a thing where that's like the obvious goal or it's right to do that. You're saying, I'm self-expressing and this is what I like. It's not because the game said to do it, it's because I said to do it. Don't people express in these communities, ultimately trying to communicate something about themselves? I think they do, but that is self-consciousness inducing, and so they want to hide behind being an authority. Again, I'm not sure you can prevent that with anything other than game design, if that. Anyway, perspective. There's really no way that people are not going to get all in a huff about the game unless they take a break. People's lives are stressful. People have a lot of stuff to get out of their system, and their recreation, that's where they do that. So if they get it all in one place, anything negative in their life is going to come in there too. It's kind of inevitable. And so encouraging people to take a break is really good. It doesn't have to be mean. You don't have to tell them to leave, but like, for example, nobody will ever do this, I don't think. But being all gung-ho about, hey, let's like not even worry about right when the update comes out, because it will be buggy and unfinished anyway. Let's just play it like a few days or a week after. This is a part where the developer really needs to make the game that way, because there are some games that will remain nameless that I've played where like you literally can't wait that long. It's beneficial to, but you just can't. You would miss things in the game. I mean, you can, but you would miss those things. That's really bad. I think that as a developer, I think that's something to avoid at all costs. Making it so the player can have an arbitrary week where they do not play the game. There, I said it. I can't resist including what the developer should do, because I think that's the real approach here. But this is a really interesting question for exactly that reason. So for a way to finish the parlay, I think from thinking about this parlay, the conclusion I drew was that the idea that it's like easy to get back into a game, that the player won't fall off and have to catch up on a bunch of information in some unwieldy way, that's really good. How? What do we do? In my notes, it says, maybe a list of resources to help players get back into a game is the end of this train of thought. Like, taking all of this as a whole, taking this advice seriously, what we should, besides the little social things I mentioned at the beginning, what we should do, what is the most helpful, is to find a better way to help players get back into a game with buildcraft stuff. Now, some games are built in a way where I don't think that's very hard. You could, in Genshin Impact, new gameplay mechanics are not very frequently added. If you simply looked up the characters and weapons and artifact sets that were added to a game anew, like if you could look up a list of those and then sort it by time, you could just find the ones you were familiar with and then read the newly added ones, and that's it. You'd be kind of caught up. There are other games like Warframe comes to mind where even if you could do that, it's just so many things that it would feel a bit unwieldy. And that makes me feel like, but how would you do this? I'm imagining a sort of shared document the community would have that would have like example builds from each time period or something. But like how would you agree on them? Like who would be the person of authority that would, and there isn't really a way to do that. Again, I would just say me, but like nobody, no one really knows, we all have biases. In a lot of these games, there is no single build that would be the perfect demonstration of this, the right answer, because there isn't one. That's kind of the whole point. And so the way these games are fundamentally structured inherently means that it would be almost impossible to give an abbreviated example of new buildcraft stuff that was added. So what but giving a sort of short notes version of what were the things that were added at different times in the game, running a poll. I'm trying to find a methodology you could actually do. So I don't know, okay, but I'll do the best I can. You run a poll every update. What is the thing in this update that you think gained you the most power? How about that? So the benefit of this is you probably don't need power in a lot of these games. They're often designed such that you won't, or the balancing is kind of loose. But if a player comes back to the game and they're looking for, what is this thing that everyone is using and I just don't know about it, it will probably be on a list that is made up of the top votes for each of those polls every update. You see what I'm trying to say? If you had a list of the results of those polls every update in a document and you could share it to them, reading those buildcraft tools would probably make them find at least the really straightforward things in the game that they would be excited about, or that would make the biggest difference if they felt like they'd fallen behind. If this is a game that makes content harder as it goes, a lot of these games don't, but a lot of them do. So there are also types of games. A lot of games where the like power level of your gear, there's something like that. A lot of those games, it's actually pretty easy most of the time to catch up because you just need to get better gear. You just do the new thing or the on-ramp to the new thing. And when I say easy, I just mean straightforward. Usually these games don't have a lot of buildcraft. They generally focus much more on like the raw power of your gear to varying degrees, but I do think that's a trend broadly. And so in those games, I've often noticed it's like more straightforward what you're supposed to do to catch up. An example of a game with basically no buildcraft, but where it's extremely straightforward would be like Final Fantasy XIV. It's comically easy to stay caught up, in my perception. When I say easy, again, I just mean it's uncomplicated. Like the amount of time, I don't know, everyone's time varies. But what you do, it could not be more straightforward. You literally just do dungeon roulettes. That's only a minor oversimplification, okay? But that game also has essentially no buildcraft, so that is it's designed not to. So anyway, I don't know. You run a poll every update and do the thing. What I don't like about that advice is that it feels like it's something you kind of can't do retroactively. You have to only start now, which I guess is fine. I don't know. Anyway, it's not perfect, but that's the best I can do. I hope that was helpful. I hope I gave like actionable things that you feel like you could do, that it's not like asking too much of people. I do think a lot of these things are not done pretty much just because of human nature. Again, I said before, I feel like the biggest obstacles in the way of these extremely straightforward things that I'm confident would make a game have a good community are that, one, some games are designed to almost literally prevent these things or to discourage them. And two, a lot of these things are literally just maturity. And it is very difficult to, I don't know, And I guess a bonus 2.5 or third point about that is that if you spend a ton of time in a game, nothing will make you a great member of that game's community. You will be hopelessly lacking perspective. There's really no way to have you have to have perspective. At the end of the day, you need to do other stuff. And a lot of games are relative haven for people that don't have other stuff to do. So that is a tension. But I think the solution is to just play other games. Like, you could still be playing games, just not the same thing all the time. Uh, Recommending other games, that's something I like, I guess is implied, but I didn't say. Obviously, yes, do that. If you liked this about this game has this, which is a little bit different like this. Don't just say I liked this game or this game is good. It's not. That's your subjective experience of it. And I do believe saying it that way means something. When you claim that as a fact, other people who didn't like that game, which is fine, it's subjective, look at you and think, oh, well, they just have no idea what they're talking about. So I can discard everything they say because they've just claimed a wrong thing. And I do think it's helpful to remove those terms from the framing of the conversation. Some of you will disagree that that does anything. I just strongly feel that you at least don't gain anything by doing it that way. So you might as well. And then, I don't know, like, what's the harm, right? Fine, maybe it doesn't do anything. I'm convinced it does, but I don't know for sure. I hope that I hope that helps. Make good communities. I feel that it seems relevant to say what I do. Like, I run a community of people who play buildcraft games for a living. That's not the same thing as your question, but it feels pretty related. So maybe I should briefly think, like, is there anything that I do that I think is just obviously sure? There are a few things that I'll briefly mention. One of them is to intend the community to only be about that thing. Providing a ton of spaces to talk about off-topic stuff sounds like a good idea, but is a mistake. It encourages people to hang out there for reasons other than the purpose of the community. And that encourages people to lose some amount of perspective on that community. It can be fun to hang out in a space. It's not bad to hang out in a space you enjoy, but it encourages people to use the space primarily for things that the space isn't trying to be good at, which does eventually erode the space's effectiveness. That doesn't sound like it would work, but I am almost the only person qualified to tell you that it does make a difference. I swear to you it does. I would know better than most people because this is literally my job. You're going to have to take my word for it to some extent. That's why I think it does. Again, I have, minor spaces on my Discord server where you can talk about other stuff, of course. Having some kind of vent on the server where people who just really want to share some irrelevant thing can put it is kind of good. I think a good solution that I have on my server is that my open channel, where you can post anything you like, well, it's on slow mode. So it doesn't reward, it heavily discourages attempting to post like just all the random crap it's not a social media feed, it doesn't work well as one. You can't post on it very frequently, if I could make it even slower, like one post per day, I would, because I think that's effective. But yeah, so that's the thing. As a creator, this is really not your question, but a big thing is like oversharing. Some anecdotal discussion can be useful, but limiting it within reason is good, because it encourages the community to follow suit and talk about the things you've prompted. This is the corollary, though, to the developer making a game that encourages good community. So anyway, there's a lot to say about that. Forgive me. I'm trying to limit it as much as possible. I think I did okay, didn't I? Anything else? I guess one other thing would be simply writing the purpose of the community a lot of places. Like, if in a game with buildcraft, the one thing I left unsaid is like most games that have meaningful buildcraft options can be played and enjoyed and be excellent with essentially no eye toward buildcraft. Genshin Impact, Warframe, Path of Exile, I think is an extreme example that I would still argue that's true. a game like Pyre, the idea that Pyre has meaningful buildcraft could totally go past someone, which is fine. That's not like wrong. A lot of these games almost intend that. And so so for me, that means I need to say, like, we are focused on the builds, that it should be driven home so people know what to expect. But in a community, it might be useful to maybe you should make a sub community that is focused on the buildcraft of Warframe, the buildcraft of Genshin Impact, rather than the game as a whole, because it can be largely irrelevant what your buildcraft is in these games. It can be really fun, but a lot of the fun is that it isn't absolutely required, which allows you to choose. And that means that you can play the game without being interested in it. So I don't know. I think that that's like, I really neglected that a lot in this parlay, but I think I'm not sure what to do about that. Maybe you make a sub community, maybe just tagging posts. I'm imagining like Reddit or Discord. I have a buildcraft help channel that I have noticed sees a lot of use. I don't know exactly how effective that is, but not just talking about like the game and its buildcraft stuff broadly, but like I specifically want feedback on this build, and people who want to do that would maybe go there. I will briefly say that I think my community is doing a 7 out of 10 at these things. Almost everybody does the verbiage thing where they state their opinion as a fact, or that there's like the build for a thing. Almost everyone does that. And so like a lot of people on my Discord server also do that. This is not evil. You're not a vile fiend for doing this, but it is only better not to. That's all I'm trying to say. So anyway, I mean, I think people make the effort on my Discord server, and generally, if somebody says like, "Ah, but you just shouldn't use that. That's just terrible," people will say, "Yeah, I don't know. Like I've had a more moderate experience," which I think is good. I think it's better than other buildcraft communities I've seen, but it's not perfect because that is extremely difficult. And I think that whenever you suggest actionable advice about these things, it's important to keep expectations in check, or just like be aware of the level of difficulty of the feat that you are attempting. This done well, these simple, easy to do things that I recommended, doing these very well is ludicrously difficult. It seems simple, but I have never, probably will never see like a community that really does all that stuff. I think after this parlay, I'll make more of an effort in my community, but forcing it doesn't work either. So I don't know. It takes a long time for things to change. Right on. I love this question, Pingers. I always enjoy parlay. I like these actionable ones. I do. It's very fun to get ones that are just thinking about a thing. But you could really do something with this one. Anyway, big fan. Thank you very much.